Every week, it seems like there's another headline telling us something about hiring. A new study comes out, a lawsuit gets filed, Workday, or someone shares an experience on LinkedIn or social media. And before you know it, people have already decided what it means, whether they have the correct information or not. And as you know, there's a lot of opinions out there. A lot. Over the last couple of weeks, I've found myself going down a bit of a rabbit hole because every post or article that I have been seeing seemed to lead to another study, another news story, and of course, another opinion that usually was not informed. I had so many tabs open and I was reading just original research. I was looking at the news coverage and even court documents. Again, there's a lot happening right now because I wanted to understand what was real. What were these lawsuits and these studies actually saying? The more that I read, the more that I noticed that the original source was often so much more nuanced than the conversation that was happening around it. By the time that a study gets turned into a headline, then there's a LinkedIn post and then there's a podcast clip. It's so easy for some of this nuance to get lost and people start reacting to somebody else's interpretation instead of looking at the original information. I'm looking at you, TikTok. I don't expect everyone in their free time to be reading research or even reading court documents, right? A lot of that is really convoluted. There's a lot of detail. And if you're not used to reading them, it can be a lot. It can be very overwhelming. But I do think that it's worth taking time to understand what the source information is actually telling us. Understanding what's happening in the job market is important, and understanding what we actually know is just as important. We cannot always rely on somebody else's interpretation. Even in this podcast, I'm going through what I have learned, and some of it is my interpretation directly from the source material. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't also go and do this research for yourself. This is how we make informed and good career decisions, not based on a headline, but based on what the information actually says. Welcome to Control Your Career. I'm Julia Toothacre, your strategic career consultant. And today is the first episode of a new format for this podcast. If you've been listening for a while, you know that I've traditionally organized this show into seasons, with each season being focused on one broader career topic. While I still like that format, there are also just more things that I want to talk about, and I want a little bit more flexibility to do that. And so we're going to start talking about more current events. I'm going to start bringing on more diverse guests to have different types of conversations around the world of work and how to help you as an employee control your career more. Going forward, episodes will be organized into collections instead of seasons. Whether you're looking for help with career clarity, career growth, career transitions, workplace dynamics, or career trends, you'll be able to find conversations around the topics that are most relevant to you without having to wait for an entire season on one subject. Today's episode is part of the Career Trends collection. From time to time, I'm going to be taking a step back to look at what is happening in hiring and employment and in the workplace. I'm not really trying to react to every headline. This isn't about clickbait, but I want to understand what's changing, what research is saying at the paper level, and how those changes are going to impact your career decisions. So in this specific episode, we are going to be looking at 3 different conversations that have really just been getting a lot of attention lately. We're going to talk about the growing conversation around hiring managers and Gen Z and how we have some generational situations going on. We're going to break down the Workday lawsuit and the Stanford AI hiring study and what they're really saying, because what they're saying and what's being reported are two different things. And we're going to wrap up. We're going to discuss personality assessments and why I think they should be used very, very carefully in hiring or not at all. It's important to note that we all have opinions on these topics based on our experiences and our positions in the world of work. My goal is to provide you with enough context to think through these topics yourself so that you can make informed decisions about your career. Let's get into it. So, the first topic we're going to be talking about is around hiring managers making decisions based on generational assumptions. And this does have to do with Gen Z. If you've spent any time on LinkedIn lately, you've probably noticed that Gen Z has become a bigger topic in hiring conversations. We just had, spring graduation. A lot of them are flooding into the workplace right now. And some hiring managers are talking about professionalism and their communication or workplace expectation. And we're hearing a lot of colleges and universities and career centers really remind employees that this generation entered school and the workforce during a pandemic. And it really changed the way that they learned, the way that they worked, and the way that they built professional relationships. Now, I've been following this conversation pretty closely over the last several months, partially because of my work with resumetemplates.com. So I am a media liaison for them. So I've done a number of interviews and contributed to a number of articles around this topic because they've done a lot of research on Gen Z, both from the hiring manager's perspective and also from Gen Z's perspectives. And there are some themes that have come up over and over again, and those themes align with conversations that I'm seeing on social media and in the news as well. There are employers who have had really genuinely frustrating experiences with early career professionals or new grads. And there are researchers that are pointing to broader economic and educational factors that provide important context. Both of these things can be true at the same time. So a manager can have their individual experience, and then there can be bigger things happening in the job market and just within that generation that are also impacting the situation. So as I follow these conversations, what keeps really jumping out at me are how these individual experiences can start to influence how we approach the next candidate that we're looking at or hiring before we even realize it. And yes, it's human nature to bring in past experiences into the next interview. But the real challenge right now is in recognizing when those experiences start to shape our expectations before we've really gotten to know the person that is sitting in front of us. And so we're allowing these individual experiences to turn into assumptions that are influencing hiring decisions, whether we're realizing it or not. And that is something that I think has been really frustrating for early career, is they're coming into these conversations and hiring managers are already reluctant and they already have a bias against them, which is not helping. Employers are frustrated. That is something that is happening. That is something that I've been hearing. Resume Templates has research on it, and there's other research out there that supports it as well, specifically from NACE. If you don't know what NACE is, I'm going to have links in the blog post for this episode so that you can look at the research that they do. But a lot of what is being talked about from hiring managers is that early career employees are having a harder time with communication. Their professionalism is not where it needs to be. They are not as reliable. They have a harder time receiving feedback, and they have a harder time meeting and understanding workplace expectations. Whether you agree with that or not, that is part of what's out there and it's part of the research that we are seeing. Does that mean that it applies to every Gen Z or early career professional? No. But those are some themes that are starting to emerge. The other thing we need to take into consideration is that new grads are coming into a really weird job market. There's a lot of layoffs happening right now. There are a lot of employers who are just simply not hiring, and they're not hiring early career. There are, I think, a lot of impacts on this particular generation with regard to COVID and online learning and the experiences that they've had. So from a communication standpoint, that probably has impacted them significantly. So they've had fewer opportunities for in-person internships and in-person relationships just with colleagues and things like that. I teach a summer course of mostly juniors and seniors in college, an internship course, and about half of them, their internships are online still. So that creates a different experience for them as a professional. They learned how to build a lot of relationships remotely or through technology, through text messages, through Slack, which is basically professional text messaging. So it's just such a different experience for them. And then they're also entering a really competitive entry-level market. Now, over the last, I would say probably 7 to 10 years, the entry-level market has been very competitive. But in the last 3 to 4 years, it's been even more competitive. And we have to look at the professionals who have been laid off, who are going for some of these early career entry-level positions because they don't have a choice. There's not enough positions out there that they want to take that they're qualified for. Now, just because these things are happening doesn't mean that early career professionals can, use that as an excuse for poor performance. That's a different conversation. But there are broader realities that I think hiring managers need to understand about this generation specifically and understand their perspective and what they're looking at and feeling and experiencing within the job market. I think the other thing for entry-level workers that we're really not talking about enough is that the expectations for entry-level have really exploded. I think hiring managers expect new grads and early career professionals to have internship work experience, which is fine, but there's not as many internships as there used to be either. They want them to have project work. I think a lot of academic programs are onto this, and I see a lot more project work on resumes these days of my students. They expect strong communication skills, and I think if you have a college degree, there is some expectation that you should have strong communication skills. But again, this is still a group that did a lot of communication online. So I think that we have to understand that it's going to take them time to catch up a little bit professionally, especially within an in-person work environment. Business awareness is a learned skill that I think so many hiring managers want early career professionals to know, and they're just not going to know. They need to be trained. They need to understand your industry, your company, and the culture and what's going on. So that's something that has to be trained. For some employers, AI literacy is a big thing. That's great, but not every entry-level worker has had experience with that. This is still a very new technology. Some people don't even like using it. And so we have to be really sensitive to that and understand that when we're hiring, not everybody's going to come in with this AI fluency. It's still so incredibly new. And then there's an expectation for early career professionals to have higher than average technical skills. And I think that's because they were raised with technology. But just because you're raised with technology does not mean that you understand excel at an advanced level. That still requires a significant amount of training. So I think even from a hiring manager perspective, we have to be really sensitive to the fact that they are going to come in with some skills and acumen, but they're not going to be at the level of your mid-career professional. And so we need to remember that. So a couple of facts that I want to put into this. This is from NACE's Job Outlook 2026 spring report. They do this every year. One of the things it said was more than 20% of employers said recent graduates are very well prepared for work, while the majority said they're reasonably prepared overall. So that's actually a much more positive statistic than I've seen in other studies and reports. And so I think one of the things with NACE is they are connected to employers that are specifically hiring early career professionals. So I think their view is going to be a little bit different, but also I think that's a really positive outlook. Also, it said that employers identified communication, professionalism, and critical thinking as areas where graduates still have room to improve. So if you are early career and you're listening to this, those are the 3 areas that you definitely want to put a little bit more effort into, or at the very least, make sure that when you're interviewing, you have examples of how you have utilized those skills so that an employer understands that you have them. Okay, so I think some of the things we need to realize about this topic is there are things that are true, and there are things that are getting really, really oversimplified. So what do we know right now? We know that entry-level hiring is very competitive. We know that employers are valuing very specific skill sets that it appears some Gen Z are still lacking, okay? And I think this idea of career readiness skills, so the communication, professionalism, teamwork, is just as important as some of the technical skills that employers are expecting from early career professionals. I do not believe, and I do not think that there's any research that I have seen out there that shows that Gen Z is a weaker generation of employees, because that's something that I've been hearing from employers is, this this is a generation that doesn't want to work. They don't want so many stereotypes and things. Millennials got that too. I just think that this is early career professionals getting stereotyped, which happens in every generation. And this is part of that oversimplification that we see on social media and through the headlines. So I see posts that say things like, I'm not hiring Gen Z anymore, and here's why. They're lazy. They don't want to work. This generation doesn't want to work. Like, all these statements are happening, and it's somebody's singular experience. It's not indicative of the entire generation. And I think that hiring managers, as you're experiencing all these headlines and posts, you need to remember that. What is your experience, and how much of your experience is nuanced, and how much of your experience is because you're not hiring well? Is your job description saying what it needs to say? Is it articulating your needs? Are you interviewing the right types of candidates? Like, there's so much more to this that we need to really think about. Having said that, I think that hiring managers do have challenges, right? They do have their own experiences that they are going through. And the problem is those experiences are matching with the data of other hiring managers. And so that makes them feel like they are justified, right? And in some ways they are, because it is their experience. But that doesn't mean that we can dismiss an entire generation because you have experienced a handful of people that, act and behave a certain way. It's important to remember millennials got this treatment too. I remember early career and all the headlines about us and everything that they were saying. So each generation criticizes the new generation coming up. That's very common. It's also a headline grabber, and we have to think about that as we're looking at all this research and we're looking at all these stories that are out there. How much of it is a headline grabber and how much of it is really true? So I want to bring in a realistic reality component for people to understand, what does this mean for me? Okay. So some hiring managers are going to be more skeptical of hiring recent graduates. And that's just real. That's just a real thing. And some of them are going to be much more open to it because they want to give back to that next generation. They remember what it was like and they want to help. So you have to ask really good questions in the interview process to understand where somebody falls within that. But I would argue that you can probably tell in an interview whether somebody is excited about an early career person or not. But there is still that skepticism there, and you just have to be aware of that. And here's the thing, like if somebody is against early career professionals, you, as good as you might be, are not going to change their assumptions within the interview. All you can do is give them as much evidence as possible to challenge whatever assumptions they're coming in with. So those skills that hiring managers are saying that Gen Z and early career are missing, make sure that you have examples for that, right? Come prepared, communicate clearly, conduct yourself professionally. There are a lot of easy things that you can do to fight those assumptions with hiring managers. Now, if you're a hiring manager listening to this, you really have to ask yourself, are you evaluating the person in front of you as an individual, or are you allowing previous experiences or stereotypes to shift your expectations because you have an assumption that they're going to act a certain way? So in that case, make sure that you're asking better questions. Make sure that you are having a conversation so that you understand how the person across from you works, so that you can challenge some of the assumptions that you are making. Okay, this next conversation that I want to have is something I have been seeing all over for months. And I wasn't going to weigh in on it, but when I decided to do this episode, I realized we have to talk about this because so many people that have big followings are getting so much information wrong. And even though I am a relatively small creator in the career world, part of the reason I'm a small creator is because I tell the truth. I tell the truth, and I don't play into clickbait. I don't play into how can I set this story up to get the most likes and the most traction and all of that. And so what I want to talk about in this next section is the Workday lawsuit and the Stanford AI hiring study, because both of these things have been taken out of context so much on every single platform, in the news, all over the place. And so we really need to talk about it. I think I follow some really amazing creators that have broken some of this down. I have gone through these as well to kind of form my own opinions and see what's out there. I have also heard the other side, which is more of that clickbait. How can I get 1 million+ views on a video? Those are the people that have it wrong. Those are the people that are giving you headlines around these two, the lawsuit and the study, these two topics that it's just not right. It's not right. So let's talk about it. I'm going to break down the Workday lawsuit first. And for the record, I am not going to go into every single detail. So this is going to be high level enough for you to understand what's going on. And then I'm going to have links into the blog post so that if you want to go in and read, you can. Okay. So what actually happened in this lawsuit? So a federal judge ruled that portions of the lawsuit against Workday could move forward. So that, I think, just happened fairly recently. So the plaintiff alleges that Workday's AI-powered hiring technology contributed to discriminatory hiring outcomes based on protected characteristics, including disability, age, and race. The judge did not decide that Workday discriminated. The ruling simply means that the claims are legally plausible enough to continue through the courts. So nothing has been determined at this point. So why does this matter? The lawsuit is asking who is responsible when AI influences hiring decisions. So historically, employers and recruiters have been responsible for hiring decisions. This case is asking whether or not software vendors may also be held responsible if their technology discriminates against applicants. Okay? What the lawsuit is not saying, what it is not saying, but what you might be hearing in headlines, okay? It is not saying that Workday discriminated. It is not saying that AI hiring is illegal. It is not saying that every employer using Workday has discriminated. And it is not saying that ATS systems automatically reject qualified people. None of those conclusions have been reached yet. We are still in the middle of this lawsuit, but people are taking information and construing it in a way that makes it sound very, very negative when nothing has been determined. So what's really happening in this, the reality of this, is that this lawsuit is forcing these questions into the open. And so I think we've heard a lot of feedback, especially from candidates, saying, I'm being auto-rejected. What is going on? And if you have been a part of those conversations, especially with a recruiter, most recruiters are saying AI is not rejecting you. It's probably a knockout question. It's probably this, it's probably that. I don't know all the systems involved. There are so many hiring systems right now. The problem is these systems do not have a good reputation, and most people don't understand how they work. So part of this lawsuit is basically saying, hey, how does this work? And we need to figure out if there is something that is causing a certain level of discrimination. And so just because there's a lawsuit happening doesn't mean that somebody is guilty yet. We're trying to figure out what is going on. And so this lawsuit is really important because it is starting that conversation. And I think whatever comes of this is going to be extremely impactful to the world of work, and specifically the role that these systems play in the hiring process. Okay, let's switch over to the Stanford study. This has been even worse than the Workday lawsuit in terms of bad information that's out there. So many of the headlines on this are extremely misleading because this study was not about AI hiring in general. So the researchers looked at one AI assessment platform used by about 150 employers between 2018 and 2022. This system was not reading resumes. It wasn't using like a chat GPT type function. The researchers were not looking at every ATS system. It was one vendor, and it was looking at their game-based behavioral assessment. Game-based behavioral assessment, okay, which is something totally different. And we're actually going to talk about assessments in another section later in this episode. So the researchers analyzed approximately 3.4 million applicants and 4 million applications. The scope of the study is important because it again applies to one assessment platform, an assessment platform, not a hiring platform, and not AI hiring as a whole. Okay, so what was the AI doing? So applicants would apply for a job, and then they were asked to complete a behavioral game or behavioral games designed to measure certain characteristics such as persistence, attention, focus, and risk tolerance. So then after that assessment, the system categorized applicants as either recommend, do not recommend. So before the system ever looked at a resume, it made them go through this behavioral assessment first to determine, do I recommend this person or do I not recommend this person for this specific position? So then employers use those recommendations as one input in their entire hiring process. This was not AI reading resumes and rejecting candidates based on keywords, which is what I think a lot of the headlines have been saying and a lot of social media posts have been talking about. So what did the researchers find in this? Okay, so one of the findings was they found position level bias. So when the researchers averaged out hiring decisions across all the employers, the system actually appeared relatively fair. But then when they looked at individual job openings, they found that there was evidence of adverse impact against certain applicants in a meaningful number of positions. So this is really interesting because it suggests that company-wide averages on hiring can actually mask what is going on with specific positions. So as a whole, it might not look like an organization is discriminating, for example, but in specific positions, they might actually be, which I feel like the average person is like, yeah, I know. But that was a big finding that was really impactful for this study. The other finding that has been really interesting is what the researchers are calling algorithmic monoculture. Okay. You gotta love academics here. Okay, so the researchers introduced this idea of algorithmic monoculture, which is really just a fancy way of saying that if a lot of employers use the same hiring technology, the same strengths and the same weaknesses can be repeated across multiple organizations. So think about it this way. If dozens of companies rely on the same assessment platform, and that platform has a blind spot, that blind spot doesn't stay with one employer. It has the potential to influence hiring decisions across all of them. This is where we're getting, I think, a lot of misinformation on headlines and talking points, because it doesn't mean I'm one person, I apply to this position, I don't get it, I apply to this position, I don't get it. And it's because I applied to the other position and they're using the same system. It's not about that. This is like a broader look. So it's not about the individual applicant, but it's about a blind spot that's across the entire system. So it might appear that it's you as an individual applicant, but that's not what it was saying. And that actually goes into the next finding, which is systemic rejection. So researchers also found that some applicants received similar recommendations across multiple employers using the same assessment platform more often than would be expected if every employer were making independent decisions. Okay. But what it didn't say is that once AI rejects you, every company rejects you forever. Again, that's what's being said online. But that's not what is actually happening. So where I'm seeing some oversimplification, especially within headlines, is people saying AI rejected my resume before anybody saw it. And they're relating that to this, they're citing this study saying, this study says that AI is rejecting my resume before anybody saw it. But the Stanford study did not look at resume screening. And so I'm also hearing people say, this proves ATS systems are broken. They weren't looking at ATS systems. They were looking at an assessment system that was doing an assessment before a system ever looked at a resume. So what the researchers actually recommended was greater transparency, regular auditing, accountability, employer oversight, and additional research, as you do in a research study. I think it's really important to remember that research studies are looking at one thing. They're not generally, unless you're doing a longitudinal study, they're not looking at multiple things. Most studies, this one included, they are looking at one thing, and that's where people who don't read research are not understanding how to read the research. And it's very obvious. So there's a couple of facts from this that I do want to pull. Approximately 90% of employers now use AI in at least one part of the hiring process. That includes everything from scheduling interviews to writing job descriptions, not just resume screening. And this was industry data that Stanford News pulled together in relation to this study. So AI is being used within hiring, but it's used in different parts, and it depends on the organization where it's being used. Okay. Whew, this is so much. So let's look at, so we've looked at the Workday lawsuit, we've looked at the Stanford study, and we've kind of gone through what they both mean. So what is the reality of these topics, these things that we're talking about here that are in the news? AI is becoming a part of hiring. It is. The Workday lawsuit is showing that, and the Stanford study is showing that. AI is a part of hiring, and we just have to be okay with that at this point. It's not going to be changing anytime soon. What I think we're going to start to see is more research, more lawsuits, and more regulation around how AI is being used. And I think that this is very common because it's a new technology, right? So what can you control as a professional? Read beyond the headline. If you do nothing else from this episode, read beyond the headline that you see, especially if that headline evokes an extremely strong emotion from you. That's what it was meant to do, which means there is likely something wrong with the headline. Something in the headline is not telling you the full truth. So read beyond what it means. Learn how hiring technology is being used. Follow recruiters, follow hiring managers. I would say follow recruiters. Follow people who are experts in the hiring process. Start learning about the common technologies that you're using and the common systems out there. And then also start honestly just really focusing on the parts of your career that AI is never going to replace. AI is not going to replace your judgment, your communication, your relationships, or your reputation. So start to focus on what you can control. What can't you control? You cannot control what systems employers are using. Unfortunately, a lot of them use Workday, and that's unfortunate, but it's a reality, and you can't control that. You cannot control whether a company uses AI, whether you think it's ethical or not, whether you think it's the right thing or not. Okay, they're still using it. You can't control that. You cannot control the outcome of an ongoing lawsuit. The reality is there's no outcome right now. We're still in the middle of it. And you can't control what the findings are going to be. And whatever the findings are whatever the findings are. And then that's the new reality that we have to deal with. positive or negative. You also cannot control social media and what goes viral on social media. And I would say 75% of the time, the thing that goes viral is wrong in some way. And so make sure that you are doing your due diligence and researching and fact checking for yourself. So as with the other topic, I'm going to put the primary resources I use to get this information into the blog post for this episode. So after reading both the lawsuit and the study, I think that I came away with a different perspective than a lot of the conversations that I've been seeing online. So neither the lawsuit nor the study answers every question about AI in hiring. In fact, what it's looking at is really narrow parts of the hiring process. But when we look at them together, they are raising really important questions about how we evaluate the tools we're using to make hiring decisions. So whenever a new hiring tool is introduced, I think it's worth asking a few basic questions. So what was the tool designed to measure? Is it actually being used for that purpose? Because I know a lot of companies that will use it for other things. Do we have enough evidence that it's helping us as a team or a company make better hiring decisions? And if it isn't, are we willing to rethink it? Because I think a lot of what happens is organizations invest in something and they feel like we have to use it because we invested in it, whether or not it's helping you do the thing that it said it was going to do. And these are the same questions that I would ask of structured interviews, personality assessments, skills tests, or any other hiring practice that we use. The technology might be different, but our responsibility to use it thoughtfully, that really hasn't changed. And I think that that's some of the gap right now between organizations and applicants. Okay, I had a lot of resources for this particular topic, so I'm going to make sure to put those into the blog post for this episode so that you can go and read the study and you can read the lawsuit on your own. So I think this is a good segue into the next section, which is going to be about using personality assessments within hiring. And honestly, I love personality assessments. They are extremely powerful, but hiring is probably the wrong place to use them. So over the years, I have administered a lot of personality assessments. I'm certified and educated in many assessments and how to use them appropriately. I use them with coaching clients. I've used them in higher education, and they've really become a foundational piece of my own career development process. So I genuinely believe that they can be incredibly valuable when they're used for the purpose that they are designed for. One of the reasons I've been paying attention to the growing number of organizations using personality assessments and assessments in general is when people start to talk about using personality assessments specifically within hiring. So depending on the company, candidates might be asked to complete assessments like MBTI, predictive index, Clifton Strengths, DISC, or some other proprietary assessment before they've even spoken to a hiring manager. That's what we saw in the Stanford study. That wasn't I don't think that was a personality assessment, but it was an assessment to look at different parts of somebody to make a recommendation. And the reason that I really wanted to talk about this is because a friend of mine was just asked to take a personality assessment, not a skills assessment, as part of an application process, and he knew he probably was not going to get moved forward because of his answers. And he really shouldn't have been taking an assessment like this in the first place. Some organizations will use those results as part of a broader conversation around a candidate. Some are going to use them to guide interview questions or think about team dynamics. But there are too many cases where I think employers, hiring managers specifically who have bias, are going to screen out candidates based on these results alone, like my friend will likely be. So it's not about whether or not assessments belong in the workplace. Like, assessments in the workplace are fine, but I think we have to really make sure that we're using them for the purpose that they were designed for. Like I said, like, I use it in my own work, but I use it as a starting point. And I think for something like hiring, even in an interview setting where an interviewer, the hiring manager might casually ask, "Hey, do you know your MBTI? Do you know your strengths?" And you not thinking anything of it, like, "Oh yeah, I'm this, da 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 da." Well, now you've given that hiring manager information to make a judgment about you. And you don't know if they've been trained. You don't know what information they have, and you don't know what kind of bias they hold. And so for years, and I had a lot of conversations in higher education around this because I was part of a lot of hiring discussions where personality assessments were used, and they were used to create a bias against somebody. And so that's part of why I feel very strongly about this. And so when I hear that companies are doing what the Stanford study was about, which is you apply, then you do an assessment, that's a huge red flag for me. Okay. So let me take a step back. Let's define personality assessments because there's a couple of different assessments that I want to make sure you understand the difference. So personality assessments are going to look at preferences, motivations, communication styles, decision-making tendencies, and work preferences. So think of something like MBTI DISC, strengths, something like that. So these are tools that really tell us how someone naturally prefers to approach their work, not whether or not they're capable of doing the work. Two different things. So then we have cognitive ability assessments. So this looks at reasoning, learning ability, and problem solving. Totally different category. And IO-Psych research, industrial organizational psychology research, has consistently found that cognitive ability tests are among the strongest predictors of job performance when they're validated and job related. Validated and job related. That does not automatically make them appropriate for every role, but they answer a different question than personality assessments. Okay, distinction. Then we have skills assessment. This is probably the only one that I'm okay with. And this is, can the person perform the work? So this might be a coding assessment, writing sample, accounting exercise, presentation, portfolio review. I think that's the most acceptable type of assessment that we can use in the hiring process. So I understand why organizations are using assessments. Hiring is expensive, turnover is expensive, and nobody wants to make the wrong decision. But if there's an assessment that promises more information about a candidate, it's easy to see why an employer would want to have this as part of the hiring process, especially if they have historically had a hard time hiring the right type of person, which then I would say is a you issue, not a professional candidate issue. And I don't have a problem with collecting more information. I think that having quality data about a candidate is really important to make an informed decision. But the question that keeps coming up for me is whether or not personality is the right information to collect before you have ever worked with somebody. I think that there's way, way too much bias in that. So can a personality assessment tell you how well somebody's going to do the job? Can it tell you whether or not they'll be a good manager, a strong teammate, or a high performer? Or are we asking it to predict something that it was never designed to predict? And that is my issue. All right. So where things are going to get oversimplified And I see this so much when people talk about hiring assessments and all of that, especially hiring managers. It's not about whether these assessments are good or not, right? We love a personality assessment. And I think when you're on a team, understanding your team is so helpful. But I think we have to ask ourselves, what question are we trying to get this assessment to answer? And is it the right one? Because usually the answer is, or the question is, will this person be successful in this role? And a personality assessment is not going to tell you that. Like we already talked about, it's only going to tell you the preferences of that person. That doesn't mean that the person can or can't do the job. Okay. So one of my biggest concerns is that this isn't, it sounds like we're having a discrimination conversation, and it's not. I mean, this isn't something that's covered under illegal discrimination, but this creates a lot of bias. It creates a lot of bias. And, I've heard hiring managers say things like, oh, I'm looking for an extrovert, or they only hire a high D personality, or that somebody just isn't a culture fit, right? And sometimes those comments are connected to legitimate job requirements, but other times they're really describing the kinds of personalities of people they enjoy working with. And that's not necessarily the same thing, right? So that's where I think personality assessments can really get misused. Most of them were designed to help us understand how people naturally prefer to think and communicate and solve problems and make decisions. They weren't designed to tell us if you're going to be that top performer. So I could be in sales and be an introvert and be extremely successful. But most people think you have to be an extrovert to be in sales. And so that's where this is hard for me to reconcile using the personality assessments to say whether or not somebody can use the job. Can do the job. So again, when we start to use these assessments to answer questions they weren't designed to answer, we really run the risk of overlooking really talented people because that person doesn't fit this generalized idea of what the right personality looks like. Or maybe that hiring manager had an experience with that personality type and they don't want to be a part of that again. Well, that's like your own personal bias that you have to separate from the person in front of you. And that's part of why I don't think that we should be doing this. So I think the other side of this conversation is that organizations think that assessments can improve communication, which is true. It can support onboarding, sort of. It can reduce turnover, maybe. It can improve team dynamics, possibly. But if you hire everybody with the same personality type, that also might be a problem. And it can provide additional hiring information, which I think is also true. I think this is fine. Like, I don't disagree with all of these, but I think if we use the personality assessment as the gatekeeper instead of the conversation starter, now we have a problem, right? So even the Myers-Briggs company acknowledges that some personality assessments are appropriate for hiring if they were specifically designed and validated for that purpose. So the issue isn't personality testing itself, but it's matching the right assessment to the right decision. And I think that's where a lot of these companies are selling a dream to the employers to get them to purchase this, and it might not be the right fit, right? So to me, this is also an ethical question because, again, I think it creates way, way too much bias within hiring. And I think that bias can then also mask discrimination. which is a bigger issue I'm not going to get into in this conversation, but is an issue nonetheless. So, what is the reality of this? Personality assessments are becoming common, and assessments in general are becoming common because companies are trying to weed out people because they're getting so many applications. Some organizations are using them well, some aren't. That's the reality of the situation. So, what can you control? Answer honestly. There is no point for you to try to game the assessment or answer in a way that you think you should. That's not going to help you in the long run. So answer honestly. Don't try to throw questions. Ask how the results will be used if you have the ability to, and then ask whether or not you will receive feedback or you will get a copy of the results. I think if you don't get a copy of the results, that would be a huge red flag for me. So what you can't control here, you can't control whether or not a company uses personality assessments. Obviously, you can choose to not move forward in the process. That's your prerogative. You can't control how much weight they're going to give those results. And you can't control how the results are going to be interpreted behind the scenes. They are likely going to make generalizations about you that may or may not be true. And that's just the reality of the situation. So as with the other topics, I am going to put different links to resources that I use to put all of this together so that you can go through and read some of this source material on your own. If you would like, those will be in the blog post for this episode. Now, as I was putting this episode together, I kept coming back to something that I talked about throughout my book and on this podcast, which is your career is shaped by more than your own choices. Unfortunately, every decision that you make is influenced by the environment around you, whether that's the labor market, hiring trends, changes in technology, or just what's happening within organizations. So that's why the first step in the control your career process is realistic reality. Before you decide what to do next, you need to understand the environment that you're operating in. Once you have a clearer picture of what's happening, you can make more informed decisions. You can set goals that align with your reality instead of clickbait headlines. And you can spend your energy on things that you can actually control. Now, I don't expect you to read every research study, court filing, or labor market report that comes out. I do that, and then I try to inform you as best I can. But I do hope that this episode at least encourages you to be a little bit more curious about information behind the conversation. Most workplace issues are more nuanced than a headline or social media post can capture. And taking just a few extra minutes to understand the evidence can completely change the way that you apply that information and think about your own career. So if you'd like to explore any of the research that I talked about today, I will include the links to the studies and articles and resources in the post for this episode on my website so that you can read them for yourself. If you enjoyed this new career trends format, I'd really appreciate it if you'd follow the podcast so you don't miss any future episodes. If you know someone who's been trying to make sense of everything happening in hiring right now, please share this episode with them. And if you have a topic, research study, or workplace trend that you would like me to cover in future career trends episodes, I would love to hear from you. So send me a message, get on my email list, and you can reply to me that way. Thanks so much for listening. And remember, you control your career.